You have probably already heard the news that the German economy is currently experiencing serious upheavals, and that industrial production is falling there. I will give my own opinion on this matter. All of Germany's current problems have quite deep roots, and they began back in the 80s and 90s when German companies began to look towards China. For example, Volkswagen opened its first factory in Shanghai in 1985. The logic of the companies was quite easy to understand. High competition forces companies to constantly improve their products, search for new methods to increase productivity, and simultaneously reduce production costs. And in the pursuit of this constant optimization, companies began to look for new production sites with lower labor costs. However, China interested manufacturers not only because of cheap labor. After all, there are a lot of poor countries with cheap labor. Moreover, the factor of cheap labor does not allow us to consider the country as a promising market for selling our own products. Simply put, poor people don't buy cars, and China is too big a market to ignore this factor. Even 1% of the population who can afford to buy a car on the scale of China is more than 10 million people. And then the question arises, why open a production in China if you can simply import your own products there? And because China has set high duties on car imports. And if a manufacturer wanted to sell cars duty-free, then it had to open a production there. By the way, it still uses this tool. And in 2017, China forced Elon Musk to open a factory there, but that's not all. The manufacturer had to not only open a factory, but also throw out a number of requirements. It had to be a joint venture with a Chinese manufacturer, with mandatory conditions for localization of production, transfer of technology, and training of Chinese people. The same Volkswagen, which I mentioned earlier, opened a production with the Chinese company SAIC, and now it is the largest Chinese car manufacturer. Do you think this is a coincidence? Of course, not everyone liked these conditions, but each individual manufacturer understood that if he did not agree, then his other competitors would agree, and he would lose the opportunity to access this market. Also, none of these manufacturers even suspected that in this way, they were creating a competitor for themselves in the future. They simply underestimated China, and the Chinese took advantage of this. Using Western knowledge and technology, they began to build their own automotive industry. Of course, they did not succeed in everything right away. The first cars were of dubious quality. Nevertheless, despite these failures, the Chinese had their own long-term strategy, which was supported by the government, and China slowly began to conquer the car market. If in 1990, China produced 500,000 cars, then in 2000, the number increased to 2 million. In 2010, production reached 18 million, and in 2020, 25 million. China simply overtook all the countries of the world. First, it conquered its own giant market, which grew along with the income level of the population, and in recent years, it has begun to actively increase its expansion to other countries of the world. If in 2020, car exports from China amounted to 700,000 cars, then last year exports increased to 5 million cars. What is 5 million cars for the global market? The total volume of car production in all countries is 90 million. 25 million is the domestic Chinese market, and 65 million remains for all other countries. That is, China was able to bite off almost 10% of the foreign market. And of course, such expansion occurs at the expense of displacing competitors in other countries. Now, car production in Germany, the USA, and Japan is lower than it was 10 years ago. And in turn, Volkswagen suffers from this. It is the second largest company in Germany, and the German economy suffers from this. On the other hand, I would not put an end to Germany. It's just that Europeans were rather late in coming to terms with the scale of the threat posed by China, and they can still recover from this shock if they change their own economic policies.